You're listening to Midlife State of Mind podcast, hosted by Erin, a midlife gal who dishes on all the challenges and opportunities that come with this middle section of your life. Each episode, you'll find yourself going between laughter and tears as she covers all the topics you need to know about midlife.
Welcome back to Midlife State of Mind. I'm your host, Erin. Thank you so much for joining me today. I need to give a little bit of background as to how the idea for this episode topic came about. I know this is probably not unique to my husband and I, but we communicate a lot through funny memes on Instagram. And you probably have that person in your life, whether it's a friend or a partner, who you see funny memes and you just send them to them. And it may not even be that you include any wording in it. You just hit share and they get it and you know that they're going to laugh at it. And how we do this is we are on opposite schedules somewhat. He goes to bed a lot earlier than me because he has to get up way earlier than me. So sometimes if I'm scrolling on IG and I see something funny at night after he's gone to bed, I send them to him. He wakes up to a lot of different little video messages from me, and then he sends me a bunch. So then when I wake up a couple hours later, I have a bunch to look at. So maybe that should be considered a love language. I'm not sure. So a few weeks back, I shared a funny video with him of a dad who was filming his kids. And on the text, it says, I asked my kids to say perfect. And so he pans to the oldest child, says, say perfect. The child says perfect, goes to the next one and on down the line. I think he had 5 kids, which, woo, more power to him. He gets to the youngest little girl and she looks to be about 2 years old. And he says to her, and she's sitting there with a big smile on her face. She's adorable. He says, say perfect. And so she says it, and it sounds like she says, F it. The other kids kind of laugh because they know she's saying what sounds like a bad word, even though she thinks she's saying perfect perfectly. And so he says again, say perfect. And she says it again, like F it, but she says the word, and I don't want to say it just for anyone who doesn't like to hear that word. And this just really just struck me so deeply. I know it was such a funny little capture of this little girl's mispronunciation. And so it got me thinking about this idea of perfection and how so many of us are obsessed with being perfect. We want perfect homes, we want perfect kids, we want perfect bodies, you name it, we want it to be perfect. And as usual, it got me searching down the rabbit hole of the obsession with perfectionism. It's that trait that makes life seem like it's an endless report card. Like we're always trying to check off our accomplishments and see how we stand. And one of the things that's important to understand about perfectionism is that there are 3 different kinds of perfectionism. There is the self-oriented perfectionism, the other-oriented perfectionism, and then the socially prescribed perfectionism. And so those all have different effects on your life. So obviously the self-oriented one is the ones where you impose unrealistic expectations on yourself. The other one is when you impose those expectations on other people. And then the socially prescribed perfectionisms are when you perceive unrealistic expectations of perfection from others. So it's reflected back onto you. And perfectionism is almost always driven by internal pressures that we put on ourselves. We want to avoid failure. We don't want to be judged. We feel like an element of control if we can control the outcome of something and make it seem perfect. And what research has shown is that this tendency for perfectionism has increased substantially, especially among younger people and regardless of gender or culture. And I thought that was kind of fascinating. And I think as a little side note, I think that's one of the best things about midlife is we start to exhibit more grace for ourselves, more grace for others, and we don't have as much of that expectation for perfectionism. And so there is several reasons that we have this obsession with perfectionism. And so like I mentioned, perfectionism is often driven by internal pressures that we place on ourselves to basically keep us safe. And in my experience, I feel like my perfectionism is a form of procrastination. It's like a way for me to, I have all these great ideas and I want to implement them, but they're not going to be perfect. So I keep putting it off until I feel like it's it's going to be perfect. So I always am like, well, it has to be absolutely perfect before I put this out into the world. And if you've listened to the podcast long enough, you know I've made some major missteps in the podcast. And so perfectionism and procrastination are intrinsically linked. So when we have these high standards and fear of failure that are associated with perfectionism, we delay doing the task as a coping mechanism so that we don't have to actually do it and possibly not meet the standards that we've set for ourselves. So it's an interesting kind of correlation. We often think of procrastination that, people say, I work better under pressure. And so I wait till the night before. My kids would do that and it would just drive me insane. But it is kind of like this vicious cycle because we end up creating anxiety around our perfectionism, and it just fuels then delaying starting whatever it is that we want to start or do. And then it's just this constant cycle of anxiety about not meeting standards. So we delay it. So then we never make any progress on it. And I do know that everyone is probably familiar with that saying, progress over perfection. And that is one of the things that for me in midlife has been one of the most liberating, if you will, concepts to really embody. Obviously, as midlifers, we have a perspective that maybe the younger crowd doesn't have. We've lived longer. We've had more experiences. And we've been able to see that when we let go of that comparison mindset that we have with other people, and we aren't beholden to that impossible perfection standard, it really allows us to have greater impact in the world, to really use our talents and our gifts and share them in a way that is very authentic. So some of the ways that we can help facilitate this is by practicing mindfulness and being in the present moment. And like I was saying, using compassionate self-talk. So giving ourselves grace, giving others grace, and then allowing us to really lean into this idea of making progress without being tied to this idea of perfection. I would love to hear your thoughts on perfectionism. Has it held you back from doing something that you really wanted to do? You can share those with me on my socials, Midlife State of Mind Podcast on Instagram and Facebook, or you can send me a message on my website, midlifestateofmindpodcast.com. If you are a new listener to the podcast, welcome to the conversation. I would love to have you hit that follow button so that you can stay in the loop whenever a new episode drops each week. If any episode has particularly resonated with you and you enjoy the content that I create, I would be very grateful if you would leave me a rating and a written review on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. And then lastly, if you are interested in some additional ways that you can support the podcast, take a look at the show notes and you'll see a list of my favorite things. These are all products that I use daily and love, and I would recommend them to any of my best girlfriends. If you do choose to purchase any of the products with the links, then the podcast does earn a small commission that just helps to offset some of the expenses of producing it. My podcast is a place where we can inspire each other to make positive changes and embrace all that midlife has to offer. Thank you so much for listening today. I'll be back next week with another episode. See you then. Bye.
This has been an E Squared production.